What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. In this video, I am going to showcase some new macros that I have created for World of Warcraft using a mod called Gnome Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create extremely powerful macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who has a disability, or for people who just want to be lazy. So keep in mind that these macros are created primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level, but feel free to use them and alter them as you see fit. If you have further questions about the mod or my macros, I recommend checking out my FAQ video, and if you'd like to learn more about how to play the class in question, you might want to check out my crash course. It can help get you started, and I will provide links to all of these things in the description below. So today we're going to check out the macros that I've created for Shadow Priests, and number one, I really like the changes to Shadow Priest, and number two, I really like how, for the most part, easy it is to macro a Shadow Priest. So let's get right into it. We're going to type /GS to open up Gnome Sequencer. Scroll down a little bit here and you can see that there are two macros for Shadow Priest, a single target and an AoE. So let's go ahead and take a look at the single target one first. Alright, so there's a lot that this macro does, and there's a lot of options that you have depending on what you want to do. Okay, so first up we have the modifiers. Well, first off, if you're not in shadow form, the macro will put you in shadow form. Pretty straightforward there. And then you've got your modifiers for your dots. Hold down Control to do Vampiric Touch, Alt to do Shadow Word Pain, and then for Shadow Word Death, you hold down Shift. Now, I was a little bit sad at the changes to Shadow Word Death. Obviously, it's a pretty cool mechanic, but you really only want to do Shadow Word Death when the target is below a certain amount of health, obviously. Shadow Word Death does have a cooldown. It would work if I just put it in the macro, but that would be two problems. One, you would be dealing a lot of damage to yourself in the process, and two, you wouldn't even be getting the full effect of it because you only want to do it when the target is low on health. So the best thing to do is to put it in a modifier, and that's exactly what I've done. Okay, so next thing, the macro will cast Power Word Shield on yourself whenever it's not there. Usually it will only cast it obviously whenever you don't have it, so it'll try to keep that up on yourself. It's great for when you're doing solo content or even in dungeons and raids. Obviously trying to keep Power Word Shield on yourself, it may not be the most efficient thing to do all the time, but it is good for survivability, so I have it there. If you don't like the macro managing Power Word Shield, you can just remove it from the macro. Okay, so let's get down into the main lines. Okay, so obviously all these do, for almost all of these, are no channeling to prevent yourself from interrupting your mind flay. You want to be getting the full effect of your mind flay in here, so for the most part this should not interrupt anytime you're channeling either Mind Seer or Mind Flay. But if you choose Damnation, the macro is going to use that on cooldown, which is nice because that makes the dot process a little bit easier. The only thing to note is that, like, say you've used Damnation and then you refresh your dots with Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch, and then Damnation comes off cooldown when you have plenty of time left on Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch. So keep that in mind. It's not really going to keep track of how much time is left on those dots. Simply, it's going to use it whenever it's off cooldown. But it's nice because you don't have to worry about your dots as much. Obviously, if you're fighting AoE, you're going to have to spread those around. But of course, you could also go with Misery as a talent, and that makes the whole dot process even easier. We'll get into that when we look at talents, of course. But there's a lot you can do there if you don't want to, like, if you want to make the dot managing process easier for yourself. There are things to do there, but what is nice is that the macro will use Damnation on cooldown and help you with your dots. Okay, so next up, Void Eruption. It's going to use that as soon as it can. It's going to use it when it's on cooldown. The only downside to this is that a lot of people recommend that you have a little bit of insanity pulled up before you use Void Eruption. This is simply going to use it on cooldown. It's going to use it right away, okay? And then during combat, it's going to use it as soon as it comes back off cooldown. So that's something to keep in mind. And then, of course, Void Eruption will become Void Bolt, and it's going to use that on cooldown as well. But it's for simplicity. That's what these macros are designed for. I say it every time. They're designed for simplicity, and it's nice. The macro will simply just use the ability on cooldown, and then it'll manage it as Void Bolt. So that's nice. You don't even have to worry about two separate abilities there. It just switches and the macro recognizes the change. So it's very nice for it to be able to manage that. And then of course next, it's going to be spending your insanity on Devouring Plague. Just going to use it whenever you have enough insanity. For the most part, you should never overcap insanity. It should just try to use it as much as possible. So, you know, of course, if you're like, you know, you're holding off slightly to try to get the most uptime on Devouring Plague or the most efficient, obviously the macro is simply going to use Devouring Plague when it has enough insanity and it's, you know, it's at that point in the priority. So keep that in mind. You may not like how often, or maybe it's just that it's not doing it perfectly, but again, that's the quid pro quos with these macros, is they're not perfect. They're not ideal for min-maxers. They're ideal for people that are looking for a simpler experience, or for people who would need these if they have like a special need or disability. So keep that in mind, but it does work well for the most part. From what I've seen, it does do a good job at just using Devouring Plague when you have the insanity, basically just managing all of your insanity for you. You don't have to keep track of it, so that's kind of nice. Next up is Shadow Fiend. It's going to use that on cooldown. Now the thing is, we'll get into Power Word Infusion in a second, but I might, when I level up my Shadow Priest, I might move this to the bottom here. It just depends, but we'll get into that in a second. Okay, so Mind Blast is next. Now Mind Blast is the only ability that doesn't have no channeling in the line, and that's because you have a chance for Mind Blast to be instant cast and usable during Mind Flay. Okay, so in order for that to work, if I put no channeling in there, then the macro is not going to use Mind Blast at all when you're channeling Mind Flay. So I had to keep Mind Blast, you know, without the no channeling line, so that way you could use it whenever you get the free proc, and it does work, but sometimes you might interrupt your Mind Flay with a Mind Blast. So that's honestly pretty much okay. You want to use Mind Blast on cooldown. So it's not that big of a deal, but just something to note. You want to get the effect of getting that free Mind Blast. So that's why it's like that. But I just wanted to point that out. And then of course, Void Torrent. That's if you choose that as a talent, the macro is going to use it on cooldown. Pretty straightforward stuff. And then lastly, you've got Mind Flay, obviously. So that's your filler. Once everything else can't be used, it's going to be using Mind Flay. Okay, and you're going to be using Mind Flay a lot. That's what the macro is mainly going to be doing, because a lot of these are going to be on cooldown. So that's the idea there. Now, I have not leveled up enough to get to Power Word Infusion, or not Power Infusion is what it's called. This is like your offensive cooldown. It's your buff. Basically, I don't know if this is on the global cooldown or not. If it's not, then I'll probably will move Shadow Fiend down to that section, and then just because Shadow Fiend is a long cooldown ability, I might move Shadow Fiend down there. I don't know yet. I might leave it where it is, but I know that eventually you will unlock Power Infusion, and when you do, the macro will simply use it on cooldown. But I haven't gotten to that point yet. I've never used Power Infusion, but I did just want to point that out. So, but the macro will use it on cooldown. So next, let's look at the AoE version here. And this is going to, for the most part, do pretty much the exact same thing with a couple of minor changes. Obviously, you're going to be using Mind Seer instead of Mind Flay. Everything else is the same, except I've added a couple extra lines here. So we'll get into talents here in a moment. But if you choose Searing Nightmare as a talent, the macro is going to use that. If you don't, the macro is going to use Devouring Plague to spend your insanity. Okay, so the idea here is that the macro will only use Devouring Plague if you haven't chosen Searing Nightmare as a talent. If you have, the macro will no longer use Devouring Plague when you're using the AoE macro specifically, right? It will only use Devouring Plague on single target, and when you're doing AoE, it will use Searing Nightmare. Okay, that's the idea here, and that's how this macro is going to work. Okay, pretty straightforward stuff, but I did want to point that out. Okay, so the idea here is that you get all that Searing Nightmare, all your insanity is being spent on Searing Nightmare, and you get the most out of that. Okay, so having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual talents themselves. There's a couple that we can probably go over here. We can talk about. I kind of have to look through them. The cool thing is there's a lot of them that are passive. So right here, Searing Nightmare, it's the third section, third row, I should say, or third column. I don't know. I think it's row. Anyway, third level 30. Okay, it's getting late. I apologize. Misery obviously is going to make things easier for dots, but if you do go with Searing Nightmare, just know the AoE macro specifically will use Searing Nightmare. We'll spend your insanity on Searing Nightmare. The only other one, well, there's a couple, I guess, that we need to go over, but the big one is Shadow Crash. Unfortunately, as cool of a talent as this is, it is a target location talent, so the macro can't use it. You'd have to use it on a separate button, unfortunately, unless you want to cast it at your feet. But you know, you're a ranged caster, so that may not work out too well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Obviously, the macro will use Void Torrent, as we've covered, and then if you choose Mindbender, then the macro will use it as it would Shadow Fiend, because it simply just replaces Shadow Fiend, and the macro will recognize that change and use it accordingly. So that's nothing to worry about there. Last line, the only other talent that I didn't include is a very popular one, and that is Surrender to Madness. So if I put this in the macro, it's simply going to use it on cooldown, and that could be a problem with how this ability works. So Surrender to Madness is definitely the talent that you want to manage separately. Otherwise, you're going to be in for a lot of trouble if you just let the macro manage that one. So otherwise, that's pretty much everything that you need to know about how these macros work and how they work with the talents. But let me know what you think about them in the comments below, and I will see you guys on the next one. And that's basically everything you need to know about these macros and how they work. Remember, these macros work best when they are spammed. So either press the button as fast as you can, or use a rapid fire button, which is fair game as long as you're the one pressing the button. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find payspin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw pastebin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /GS to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.